very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Interface. My name is Tembisa Magele. Well, we hear a lot about corruption in the public sector, as you know. It happens all the time, that's what we're told. But we hardly hear anything about what's happening in the private sector. Why is that? Is it because corruption in this sector is so little that it's not worth focusing on? Well, tonight on Interface, we are turning the spotlight on corporate South Africa and looking at corruption in that sector and also the importance of ethical behavior in corporate South Africa. And as always, we are very keen to hear what you think about this topic. So do drop us a line on our Facebook page at Interface on SABC or on Twitter at Tembisa Magele or at Interface on SABC. Now, to talk to us about this, we are joined by Whistleblowing, who is the president of the Progressive Professionals Forum, and we're also joined by Alana Bond, who is from Simanye Consulting, and Liesel Groenewald is in our Cape Town studio, and she is with the Ethics Institute. And welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
I'm going to kick off with you, Whistleblowing. We hear so much about public sector corruption and very little about what's happening in the private sector. Is that because things are just not so bad in that space?
I think we'll start by saying corruption is bad, corruption is morally and ethically bankrupt, and let's also acknowledge that corruption is a global issue, it's a global phenomenon, so we're not alone in South Africa.
Right.
So let's just start there. And then say indeed that in South Africa, corruption is on two camps, is both in government and in fact in the private sector it's more. You must remember that we've got what I would call intra-corruption and inter-corruption. Within inter-corruption, you've got government and private sector corruption, which when the two are interfacing together. But private sector on its own has got its own intra-corruption. So therefore, in terms of proportions and scales, private sector is a hell of a lot more corrupt than public sector. And in fact, if one considers that private sector runs 70% of our GDP, the problem as a result of corruption within the private sector is huge for the economy, because through corruption, even the unit price goes up, competition is affected, a whole lot of things. So indeed, there is corruption in the private, but the coverage of corruption by yourselves, people in the media, is hopefully too low. It's almost like you don't understand that it's corruption when it's private. We should be asking you, why is it that you people in the media are not covering corruption in the private sector?
I hear you, and I'm actually going to ask you that because hopefully you'll give us some thoughts on what we can do. But Alana, do you agree with that? Do you agree with what Whistleblowing is saying, which is also something that Judge Willem Heath said a couple of years ago, that corruption is much worse in the private sector?
It's hard to say, Tembisa. I'm not an expert in the space. I don't claim to be. But I think the stats are quite wide-ranging, and some of them may be a little out of date. Some of the information that I've seen seems to suggest that the corruption in the public sector may be worse than the corruption in the private sector when you consider the size of the private sector versus the public sector. But I think fundamentally we have to consider the fact that when we're dealing with the public sector, we are dealing with something that impacts very fundamentally on the taxpayer and probably more importantly the citizen on the street. So that may address one of the reasons why we tend to hear about it more and the media may focus on it more. And then it also may be around which media is focusing on which issues.
That's very interesting. Is that because the assumption is taxpayers' money, hard-earned, hard-fought for, and therefore needs to be protected, and investors don't really care so much how the money is gotten as long as it's in the bank? Is that the assumption?
The response, that is actually incorrect. It's fundamentally incorrect.
How so?
The construction sector, 2010, 50 billion that Fiscus has lost was public. Was taxpayers' money. Government was ripped off by the 5 construction companies, 50 billion, and the coverage of that was next to nothing. Recently, SARS has reported that something to the tune of 250 billion gets lost through all kinds of transfer pricing schemes and so on that private sector gets involved into. So the issue of is because of the size and whatever is actually not true. Private sector, there's clear empirical evidence that shows that the corruption in the private sector is of a hell of a lot more. As I've given you the numbers now, 50 billion in the construction, and I can give you sector by sector. 50 billion in the construction sector. SARS alone has picked up 250 billion. You don't have those kinds of numbers in government.
All right, before Alana, you respond, I want to bring Liesl into the conversation. Liesl, what are your thoughts on this one? Where is corruption at its worst, public or private?
Well, that's quite a difficult question if one doesn't have the stats in front of you. But in terms of the private sector, which is basically my focus, we do see that misconduct within organizations, which of course include corruption, that has seemingly risen over the last 3 years, according to a recent study that we conducted, the South African Business Ethics Survey 2016. And of course we see from the Auditor General's findings that corruption in the public sector is also rife. So whether one can say it's more in the one sector than in the other, I'm not quite sure at this point. And I would like to have some statistics from my friend there in the studio with you when he says that it is, to quote, a hell of a lot more in the private sector. We see that in the private sector over the last year or 3 years, that 25% of employees, that's a quarter of employees, have actually witnessed unethical behavior or misconduct. And you know, that's quite a rise. It's 11% rise since 2013.
What do you attribute that to,
something
though?
is increasing.
What do you attribute that increase to?
Just a moment. Mostly the economy, the economic situation in our country. We see that people are under pressure in terms of their own financial resources. I think perhaps there are more opportunities at work. Your corporates and other companies, they have been putting more controls into place to prevent corruption. But you know, you can only have so many controls. If one does not have an ethical culture within the organization, then all the controls in the world are not going to assist, because the more controls there are, the more people are on the lookout for loopholes.
We have to take a short break, unfortunately, and I do want to pick up on this point with my guest in studio. And the point is, are there controls in place? And if so, are they enough? But we have to take a short break. We're back after this. Welcome back. This is Interface, and we're talking about corporate corruption. And we're asking you the question, do you care? Or do you only care about how your money as a taxpayer is spent? Give us those thoughts on Facebook and also on Twitter. Two things coming out just before the break. One is, if things are so bad, Jimmy, as you say, in the corporate space, if corruption is so rife, why are we not hearing about it as much?
One of the reasons is because given different names, it's not labeled corruption. For instance, collusion.
Yeah.
Collusion is corruption. You hear about insider trading. That is corruption. You hear about these things every day. There's all kinds of euphemisms. This thing is hidden. Let me finish.
Yeah, but why are we euphemizing it? Why are we doing that as the media? What do you think?
I think it's you see, this thing also has got a race element. Let me get to it just now. But lastly, on the other line of euphemism, when it's government, you hear things about kickbacks and all kinds of things. When it's private sector, no, it's called an introduction fee, it's called a promoter's fee, it's called all kinds of fees. But when it's this side, all kinds of funny names get given. Yeah. In the private sector, in government side as well, you also have a very, very punitive language from the PFMA. For instance, the Auditor General would report that 20 billion irregular expenditure. And an immediate assumption is going to be made that is because that is corruption. When in fact it could have been a simple thing of, just an example, when you should have issued a tender on a particular product or service, you decide, no, you're going to do it quick and take 3 quotes. Government could get all the value out of those 3 courts, everything could be clean, but simply because it did not follow prescript, that amount is classified as irregular. Now, to the public eye, it means that somebody has done something wrong. So there's something wrong with the language that creates a problem.
I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on the racial undertones that you're picking up on. But before you do that, let's talk about the controls that are in place. Are there enough controls in the private sector to deal with corruption?
Tembisa, I think that controls exist, but I think that a lot more needs to be done. I think that employees often are not aware of what actually constitutes corruption. And I think that the points that have been made today really line up to that fact, because as we've said, there's many categories and there's many buckets that we can put this into, and not everyone is aware of how important this is and what to do with it. And when there are controls in place, for example, whistleblowing is one of the key things that, other employees seeing their compatriots doing something wrong, there's not enough protection for whistleblowers. And there's not enough work being done in terms of internal audit and those types of controls to find people that are acting corruptly. And then also, I think from there, to act on it. And I think one of the biggest challenges in this space is the fact that people have taken perhaps a laissez-faire approach sometimes to corruption, because there's very little certainty that anything is going to happen with it, with regard to reporting it to the police and the justice system as well.
But let's look at reporting in the media. We are very quick as the media, as well, it was highlighted earlier, to talk about what's happening in government. Oh my goodness, look at how bad things are. Why do we sugarcoat it when it comes to the private sector? Why do we call it collusion and insider trading and all of these not so bad terms? What are your thoughts?
Are they not so bad?
Not as bad as you are corrupt.
Well, I think that, I guess that's how you define it. But when I hear about things like insider trading and all of these kinds of things happening in the private space, I'm very concerned about it. I do think, though, that sometimes it depends on what media you're looking at. Your business papers and business magazines and those kinds of industry media are more likely to focus on the corruption. And let's face it, there has been a lot made out of the cartels in terms of bread fixing, price fixing with bread, price fixing with milk, which affects the poorest person on the street. We certainly did hear about the corruption in terms of the 2010 World Cup. I think we do hear about it, but I think that fundamentally, because one is dealing with taxpayers' money and the citizen on the street, there is always going to be an important additional focus that needs to happen with public sector corruption.
So we hear about it. Where are the racial overtones?
The reason you don't hear about it is because media is a business. So the people that do these things is their colleagues. This is the issue. And I think we must disabuse ourselves of the myth that media is an honest broker. Media is not an honest broker. A lot of media people, in fact, generally all media is, except obvious SABC because a public broadcaster, but generally all other media are actually owned by private entities. So they are business. They are there to push for the bottom line. So let's not forget that.
But where are the racial overtones?
The racial undertones here. Let me give an example. Did you know that February this year, somebody in the Western Cape Council has been busted for 70 million rand squander? You didn't know this.
No.
This is because it's in Cape Town. You don't know this. That the Western Cape municipality is dealing with a 28 million rand corruption, money lost through corruption, through some World Cup, something that they were doing last year. Nobody knows about this, simply because it happens in the Western Cape, Cape Town, which is largely white and all of that. So therefore this can't be. But let it be. You see, the narrative is that everything to do with black people, everything to do with ANC government is corrupt. We have now spent in this country 113 million rand to prove that there was no corruption in the arms deal. Simply because we've got an ANC government, people think there is corruption. We have now, the SG of the ANC, for instance, has been calling upon people to come and report these corrupt activities of these Guptas with the government and all of this. And he said, everybody come and deposit the evidence, everything, come and tell me. And then in the last briefing, it tells us that only one person has come up with a formal written submission. So what is this? So it's a whole discrediting narrative because black people are involved, because ANC government is involved.
Liesl, you're in Cape Town. Are we treating you with kid gloves there in Cape Town because you're largely white?
Tembisa, no, I don't think so. I think one should look at it more broadly and not, attribute it to racism or to a specific race. Corruption is everywhere. It affects everyone. It is across all races. It's across all cultures. It's across all nations. So if we think of your big corporates and their involvement in corruption, yes, it is called perhaps not corruption per se, but we all know that price fixing and the rest forms part of corruption. We talk about facilitation payments, and did you know that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the US actually allows facilitation payments for your routine dealings with foreign governments. But it's not allowed in the South African law and many of the laws on our continent. But it is there, and I just want to come back to the controls and to the whistleblowing that was mentioned earlier, because companies have been putting in more controls. They are forced to do so in some sense through regulation and through legislation. But we see very much that there's what we call a compliance approach, which means let's just get all these policies in place and we follow the regulations. But the more controls there are, the more people try and find a loophole, as I've said before.
All right, now we have to take another short break. Unfortunately, we're going to come back to this point. I know, time is not on our side, and we have to pay our bills, so we're back after this. Corruption in the private sector. Your thoughts on Facebook at Interface on SABC or at Tembisa Magele on Facebook and Twitter. Where is the shareholder activism? Where are the investors that are going to say, this is the punishment that we need to mete out where corruption is found? Are we seeing enough of that?
I don't think we are seeing enough of that. But at the same time, I think that the private sector tends to deal with these things sometimes in different kinds of ways. So certainly what I've experienced is people being quietly allowed to resign as opposed to being forcibly dismissed, and it not being made sort of public knowledge that they've been involved or implicated in corruption, which means they go on to the next job in the corporate sector. No one around them really knows about it, and as a result, things continue that way.
But why is that allowed to happen, Liesl? Why do we do that?
I think, there's a cost involved in getting people to, let me just start again. There's a cost involved in criminal proceedings of employees. So very often, and we see that, very often employees are just given that handshake because it's too much of an effort perhaps to go the law enforcement way. Or, of course, if it becomes known, it tarnishes the reputation of that specific company. So what companies rather do is to give that, say, go quietly and even give the people some money, and they just pop up in the next company. What we find in the financial sector, however, is that they are registered on REDS, which is a database. So every time someone is employed in the financial sector, at least they have to go to this database. So in that regard, there are good controls in place. But I think it's again that reputational harm that it will cost the company if it becomes known that one of their employees, and especially your high-level employees, have been involved in white-collar crime.
Do you agree with that?
No, look, I think I agree with that, but I think if you contrast it to public sector, for instance, there is more controls in the public sector. There's not only just King Code, which is a recommendation. There are laws there. If you don't do this, you violate a law. So it's not the absence of controls within the private sector. It's not the absence of checks and balances. All of those are there. Indeed, it's an issue of personal integrity that gets involved. It's issues of value systems of individuals that get involved. That's why, for me, I'm very happy when government at an institutional level acts on corruption. President Zuma, for instance, is the president that should go down on record as the president with the highest number of SIU proclamations to probe corruption. As you know, no other president has issued a number of, which shows that the government of South Africa has got zero tolerance in terms of corruption.
Let me throw this thought at you. When corruption is... Okay, Liesl, you want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah. No, I want to say, yes, we can have all of this legislation that has been imposed on government and in South Africa, and in South Africa has really done a lot. I do agree with that. But it seems as if nothing happens. So once people have been caught being involved in corruption, we don't see the outcome. We don't see that there's punitive measures that are being taken.
That's both in public and private.
It's what you... nothing is happening. And that's also why employees in companies don't report misconduct. We saw in the last 3 years that of the 25% of people who have observed misconduct, less than half actually reported it. And why didn't they? It's two reasons. One is they don't believe that anything will happen to their report, that the company will do anything. And the second one is main reason for not reporting is fear of victimization in the workplace.
All right, just hold that thought, Liesl, for me. Why is there no severe punishment for corruption when it's found?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's no severe corruption per se, but I think what people forget is that in South Africa we've got a constitutional democracy. Therefore, we've got rules, we've got procedures, we've got processes. The fact that you are aware of something is not enough to get a person arrested. It must still be an investigation process. Now, people are not patient enough with processes. And you may think something is not happening, you may think nothing, but later you then find that so-and-so, let's look at, for instance, in the Northern Cape. Before we knew, John Block got his processes onto him and things happened to him. All along, people have been saying, nothing is happening, corruption is tolerated, but things happen behind the scenes. This is why it's also important to allow the institutions of government to do what they need to do quietly without being interrupted. The hawks are busy on their processes. Yes. Let them do what they need to do without being harassed.
Are we more tolerant of corruption in the private space as we are in the public space? Alana?
Wow, talk about putting me on the spot, Tembisa. I think that possibly we are. And I think that in some ways, to some extent, possibly we need to be. I think that there should be a zero tolerance of corruption across the board. I think, once again, when it comes to taxpayers' money and citizens on the street that are being affected by non-service delivery, it becomes absolutely critical to ensure that corruption in the government is minimized. But having said that, we absolutely have to take a harder stance on corruption in the private sector. At the end of the day, the only thing that's fundamentally going to solve the poverty situation, the poverty crisis that we have in this country is a growing economy.
But the private sector then says, you know what, if you are going to keep at us on corruption, jobs are going to be lost. You know, if you come at us, jobs are going to be lost.
I must state this, Tim. I think it's a very incorrect view and narrative and a posture to say that the reason you get to be aggro on government is because it's private sector, is public purse, as it were. I think it's a very myopic view with due respect. We need to understand that private sector and corruption cost the citizen just as much, if not more. Understand that all these monopolies or oligopolies that do their corrupt activities, that do all their kind of...
I'd like to see the stats on that.
When they do all their so-called self-regulations and cutting out competition, it means they maintain prices. The consumer has to pay more because there's less competition. So all the activities that happen in there, the corruption that happens in the private sector, intra-corruption that is there, is costing the citizen. I think it's very misguided to try and push that under the carpet.
Unfortunately, you know what? I think we need another show just to look at the work of the Competition Commission, whether or not they are being hard enough on corporates. Look at the stats. Where are they? But we have to leave it here. Thank you very much to my guests for coming through to talk to us about this. Very, very keen to hear what you think about this. So do drop us a line on Facebook and on Twitter. For now, good night.